Hi, welcome back to Neural Splendor. I had a question about fuel mileage in regards to the N14. When we talk about fuel mileage today, we really need to narrow it down to the specific engine system that we're talking about, because you do slightly different things with different systems to control your fuel mileage. So I'm going to talk about some major categories that people look at when they're speccing a truck out. And speccing a truck out is very important. They're not like cars when you go down and buy one off the lot. Yeah, you can, but if you're going to buy a Cummins engine, you should call Cummins and ask for the automotive sales, and they make a program that they use, and you'll go in and sit down with them, and they're going to ask you a myriad of questions. They're going to ask you the typical terrain you run on. They're going to ask you the tire size that you like to use, the tread pattern. They're going to ask you the typical weight you haul, what kind of trailer, what kind of loads. And they have a program, it used to be called VMS, that was Vehicle Mission Simulator. I worked with that a little bit. I used to use it to find tire revs for setting ECMs, mile per hour and tire revs, because the ECM doesn't know mile per hour, it knows drive shaft revolutions. So we have to do a little math there to make that come out to the right mile an hour. But anyway, so they very important things: rear end ratio, transmission final drive ratio. When it comes to the chassis, tire size, of course, shape of the truck. If you've got one of the older classics that have the big square nose on the truck, you're fighting the wind a little more than if you had a T800. That's KW. They made we used to call it the anteater. It had a kind of a pointed nose. And that's not a major factor, but it's one of the factors you consider. So those are general things that you look at, especially when you're buying a truck, to help you get into the ballpark of fuel mileage you want to be in. Now let's get down to the N14 specifically. There's a mechanical engine, which there weren't that many that I saw, and there's the electronics. So if you have the electronic engine, then your power band or peak torque, which is where you want to run to keep your fuel mileage optimized, is somewhere between 1325 and 1550 RPM. You should be geared so that most of the day when you're driving down the highway, you are down between around 1325 and 1550. And 1550 is on the high end. So in the old days, the engines had to rev up to get the horsepower. When I started in the business, I drove a big wrecker that had a Detroit two-cycle 318. It was a 318. It was an 8V71. And if you got below 1800 RPM, that thing was dying. So you kept it wound up between 18 and 2100 RPM. So that engine's firing the injectors a lot every minute. When you drop that RPM down, you're sending less fuel into a cylinder every minute because there's less firing cycles. That's why today on the Signature, peak torque on the brand new ones is 1150 RPM. So that's one consideration. What RPM range am I driving in? It's expensive to change out rear ends. You can swap out your transmission cheaper, and you can get a little bit steeper overdrive. So a lot of our trucks today, the top gear is that we have double overdrive. So top gear might be 0.73 overdrive, and then maybe 0.87 is the second overdrive, and then we have 1-to-1 from there, and then you go. So you can swap out your tranny and get a little more overdrive. The next thing is you have to consider is the condition of the engine. So engines have a couple problems. One is burning oil. Well, you have to add oil, okay? If you don't have after treatment, not a big deal. If you do have after treatment, that's a big deal. You have to address it. The main concern is crankcase blow-by. So if crankcase blow-by is how much of the cylinder pressure gets by the rings and goes down into the bottom of the crankcase and comes out the vent tube. So when you're pulling hard on an older engine that doesn't measure crankcase pressure, and an N14 doesn't, if you're running down the road with 12 or 14 inches of blow-by, and that's a lot under load, then a lot of pressure that should be used to do work is skating by the rings, and you're wasting fuel because that power that you made is not being used to push the piston down. It's sliding by it. So we're talking about minor fuel mileage adjustments here in the tenths, but this all matters. So that's one thing, the condition of the engine. Number two, is the overhead set properly? On that engine, the intake valves over time tend to tighten up. A lot of times the exhausts will loosen up. If you get the valves set so they're set right and the injectors are set correctly, and I'll do a video about setting the overhead on an N14. I probably won't have one that I can actually physically show you, but we'll talk about it so you'll know what to do. Those injectors have to be set properly, because if they aren't, they don't time properly. If they don't time properly, then you have injection that's off and you're going to be losing power. Now those are kind of minor nuances. Let's look at the major things. So the number one thing a driver can do when he's going down the road is, when he's pulling hard, get on the CB or have someone follow you and watch you. When you're pulling hard, are you making black smoke? Everybody thinks black smoke is a sign of power. It's not. Black smoke is fuel that's wasted. If the exhaust out of your stacks is crystal clear and you don't have an after treatment system, you are optimizing your fuel. Why do we have black smoke? On the N14, if the engine is mechanically sound, that means in time the camshaft's in good shape, blow-by is under control. The next thing that affects it is intake manifold pressure or turbo boost or charge air pressure. And when you look at the engine, you got two great big pipes on it that go up by the radiator. Those go to an charge air cooler. It's really a radiator for air in front of your regular water radiator. Those things, I think, honestly, I changed probably 300 of them when I was a tech, because they would fail a pressure test. And the only way to check them is put a slug in the rubber hose, and you put about 30 pounds of air in there. And if I remember right, you're allowed to lose about 5 to 7 psi in 15 seconds. So if you put in 30 psi and in 5 seconds you're down to 20, you either got a hole in the boot, a leaking boot, or the charge air cooler's failed. You need to fix it or replace it. You can take it somewhere and get a tube welded up if you have to, or cut out, and they have these epoxies you can put on there to seal them up. But no black smoke, okay? If the charge air system's good, you've got a boost sensor in the intake. Make sure it's accurate. The only way to do that is get a road test done. Someone will hook up an accurate mechanical gauge to the intake manifold, and they'll go on to Insight and monitor. I have had engines that read the incorrect boost. If they read the incorrect boost, The ECM fuels according to the pressure in the intake manifold. There's a table that it has to follow. So if your boost sensor is reading high, in other words, it's telling the ECM I've got 20 inches of mercury, but there's really only 10, it's going to overfuel and it's going to be running dirty. Now, when I say crystal clear, I'm talking about going down the highway to the naked eye. Those engines never burned as clean as the common rails do, but if when you're going down the highway and you're pulling, all you really see is the heat signature out of the stack, you're in pretty good shape. So the big one is make sure that charge air system is in good shape. Make sure your turbo's in good shape. Those turbos didn't have speed sensors, so you have to just pull the exhaust in the intake and look at those impellers. I'm going to put up a video on how to inspect your turbo. Even though I'll be talking about a newer VGT, I'll be talking about the impeller, and that applies for all the turbos. And then the last thing is the calibration in the engine. So a lot of guys will run out and get someone to put a 525 1850 torque code in their engine. If your engine was built with parts that weren't designed for that fuel calibration, you're not going to get good fuel mileage. There's a science, starting with the electronic engines, there is a science in what parts are in there, how they're put together, how they're adjusted, and then your fuel calibration. The N14 didn't have smart torque. So when we talk about fuel mileage on a diesel, you want to run in your torque band, okay? Your peak torque band. I said earlier, 1325 to 1550 on the N14. If you can stay there and not have smoke, and you've got enough torque to do the job you have, then that's as good as it's going to get for that engine. I do know guys that hauled coast to coast, in other words, say New York to California. There was one guy that always hauled down to Texas from somewhere in Ohio, and he used to get about 5.2 miles a gallon, and he was a cowboy. He ran 80 miles an hour, but he had, I think, 323 rear ends, and he had pretty tall tires. So he had to stay in his peak torque, and he didn't haul much more above maybe 70,000 gross. And he hauled a van, and he had one of those round caps on the front of the van. So, you know, that's the best he could do. So I hope that helped you when we're talking about the N14 and fuel mileage. Calibrations are important. You remember that horsepower doesn't pull you down the road or up a hill. Torque does. So stay down in that peak torque band. Make sure the engine is adjusted correctly, is in good shape, blow-by wise. Make sure your air filters are clean and not plugged up. And then last, make sure the engine's got the right calibration and the truck is spec'd out right. And by the way, you can go to Cummins, even if you've already got the truck, and have them run this test for you. It's just a software program on the laptop, and they can tell you what your fuel mileage should be. And if your truck isn't spec'd incorrectly, if somebody ordered that truck years ago to haul Euclids, it was never designed to get fuel mileage. It was made to make brute power and pull seriously heavy stuff down the road. You're not going to get good mileage with that truck. So get the VMS done. It's not called VMS anymore. Just tell them you want them to run the program that calculates fuel mileage, and you can go in there and just ask them, hey, this is what I've got. Tell me what I should be getting. And then if I'm going to buy a new truck, I'm going to buy Cummins, what would be the ideal truck if I wanted this mile a gallon? And they'll ask you the questions you need to know, and they'll help you out. Have a good day. Thanks for watching Neural Splendor. Subscribe. Thank you.